Welcome to another Kingsley Gate in the Spotlight. My name is Andy Davis, and I'm a member of the Global Board Practice based in London. And today we're going to talk about the evolving requirements of ESG and how board members can best support that, because it's an area that I think is quite not only brand new, but also misunderstood. So I've got an expert with me today to talk us through that, Maja. Maja, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Maybe you could just say a little bit about your background.
Great, thanks a lot for having me. Yes, so I've worked on ESG sustainability topics for all of my career within both the public and the private sector. I spent about 10 years living and working in Africa, working for the British government. I then moved on to do consulting research work for a couple of years for the bank, OECD, UN, those sorts of multinational organizations. And for the last 8 years, I've been at the largest renewable energy generator in Europe, a company called Statkraft. It's headquartered in Oslo, but with hydropower, wind and solar assets in 18 countries across Europe, South America and India. And we produce about 70 terawatt hours a year. And last year we had revenues of 8.7 billion euros. And we see ESG topics cropping up all over that agenda. And I hold the role of Senior Vice President responsible for the overall sustainability ESG strategy of the company. I'm also responsible for governance and compliance matters at corporate level.
Wonderful, and thank you again for joining us. One of the reasons that I invited Maja to talk today was based on the board program that I run, which we held last November. And it was very clear that this was becoming, if not the most important new topic, then certainly a very, very hot topic. And I think there was a difference of opinion in terms of exactly what ESG meant. And I think, Maja, if you don't mind to begin with, it'd be very, very helpful if you just could explain to everybody exactly what ESG is all about.
Yes, I would be more than happy to try to do that. I'm going to bring up a couple of slides just to help illustrate a few of the points. So I think the important thing to start with on this topic is that there is quite a lot of ambiguity, as you say, around the terminology. ESG is often used interchangeably with sustainability. And I think where you see sustainability often used as a broad umbrella term for doing things right, doing things ethically, responsible business practices. ESG can be thought of as a set of criteria for evaluating a company's performance around these three topics of environment, social, and governance. And I think that the focus here is very much to look at how the company manages its own footprint and impact, whether that be on biodiversity and climate issues or on its relationship with customers, suppliers, communities that surround its operations, or governance topics where we see an increasing interest and focus on business ethics and diversity as important topics. And this term was coined, the ESG term was coined nearly 20 years ago as part of a UN initiative in 2005. And since then, we've seen it grow from being more of a niche sideline interest to a massive portfolio with numbers now around US dollars 30 trillion of assets labeled in some way ESG assets under management. So it's become, as you indicated, very much part of the mainstream these days.
Fantastic, thank you.
And if I could just perhaps add on a few thoughts on how it's evolved. I think the interesting thing about these topics is that through that sort of journey, and here I've stretched it even further back in time, this focus on a company's impact on its surroundings has always been there, but now we see it changing quite a lot in recent years. And if you permit me perhaps to highlight 3 trends that I see as important coming up around this. We see that the scope has widened in terms of the topics that are included. Before, it might have been more around health and safety. Today, we have a whole range of additional topics. And we see that it moves from more of a voluntary space to a more formalized, regulated, mandatory space. And lastly, that companies, I think, are increasingly becoming aware of this as being an opportunity space, not just a set of risks that you have to manage, but a way to differentiate your company and become more competitive as well.
Thank you. I'm beginning to hear the voices of some of the board members that I work with ringing in my ears, which is, this all sounds fantastic. It also sounds quite expensive. Is it possible to run a profitable business, but also adopt best practice as far as ESG is concerned?
Yes, I think that's a very good question, and just the last image to show in that regard. I think I can very much understand that reaction when you look at the jungle of initiatives and requirements and expectations cropping up, both on the legal side, but also in terms of the customer perspectives, the rating agencies. This is quite an overwhelming, or can be perceived to be quite an overwhelming agenda. But I think for me, based on our experience, the good thing is that we see that you can approach ESG performance improvement in an incremental way. It doesn't have to be a question of investing in everything from day one. For instance, we see that many companies have for some time invested in having robust management of health and safety issues that have been on the agenda for years. And by looking at how you can extend and build on the practices that you've established around one topic, such as health and safety, look at how you can extend those practices to other topics. Can be a cost-efficient way of approaching it. And I think a second thing to remember is sometimes when we have these resource allocation discussions, I think we run the risk of taking too much of a narrow focus for calculating cost benefits of an investment. And I think with ESG, it's important to remember that the benefits can be quite extensive and at times a bit difficult to measure. But what is the benefit of improved performance on talent retention, on competitiveness of your products in the market, of the investors, the cost of capital? We see that coming down for companies with a better ESG score. And then on the flip side, I think we can risk underestimating the costs of not managing these topics well enough. And companies that have been through trouble, they will know what the price tag of that looks like. And I think that sort of knowledge would need to feed into a slightly wider look at the cost benefit calculations on this topic.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, it's no great surprise there are certain sectors that for obvious reasons are further ahead than others in this regard. So obviously your own sector in the energy space, also manufacturing, but there are other sectors that are maybe a little further behind and are beginning to think about this, maybe even for the very first time. What should companies consider, do you think, when they're seeking to adapt their business to an ESG framework?
Yeah, I think your point about being conscious of the sector you're in and also the geographies that you operate within is an important starting point. It should not look the same for a company that has a predominant operations in Northern Europe to one that has extensive business in higher risk jurisdictions. So that needs to be an important part of your starting point. I think perhaps a useful way of thinking about this is to think about ESG both in terms of what you produce, but also how you produce it. So let's say you're a packaging company that produces packaging. Now think about what are the strategic opportunities around a better ESG performance around the products that you offer to the market, and how will that benefit you, and what priority should be given to, for instance, having more environmental environmentally friendly packaging available in your product offerings. But then at the same time, think about how that production takes place. And here I think the critical thing is to have a materiality focus, that you don't go after all risks or all opportunities. You look at the topics that are most material to you, that are most present for you and your customers and your stakeholders, and those are the ones that you focus on first.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And now that we have given, I suppose, a good explanation of what ESG really means, and we're seeing it increasingly at the board level, either directly on the agenda or certainly individuals having a responsibility to report on it. What's your advice to boards and how they should engage on ESG?
So I think speaking from a practical perspective of being in a company myself, I think it is absolutely essential that the board takes an interest in this agenda. Because as the old saying goes, what gets measured gets done. I think if ESG is nowhere on the list of priorities that the board focuses on in its follow-up of senior management and company performance, then you run a real risk of it not being on the agenda of the company further down the chain as well. And that's quite natural, because these topics are often somewhat peripheral to the core commercial concerns that the company has been used to dealing with historically. So you do need a little bit of an extra push, in my experience, from management and down, to make sure that people take the time to address these issues, as well as what may be perceived as more core and central to their commercial activities. And I think that there is now of course, there's a lot of evidence now of large institutional investors starting to hold boards more accountable exactly for this, on this point, that we see some very interesting developments in that regard. And I think we can also see it now in the shape of new regulation coming in that's becoming more specific and explicit on the expectations to boards in this regard. But what's interesting, I think, is asking the question, do the boards in a way have the capabilities, the competence needed to know what to ask for, to know what to measure, to know how to separate something that might look more like window dressing from real progress? And I was interested to read a survey from PwC from last year that suggested that only 1 in 4 board members state that their board has sufficient competence, skills in the ESG space to be able to do this adequately. So I think it is definitely an issue to focus on. And if I were to think of 3 key points that I would recommend boards to focus on this topic, I think it's interesting to start with the question: how does ESG feature in the corporate strategy of this company? Is it relevant? Is it captured? Is it integrated? A second question I think would worthwhile asking is how robust is the management system of this company to address the risks that come up around ESG? And then a third question, when you make the many decisions that you make at board level about new investments, new projects, new customers, is ESG reflected in any way in those practical, important business decisions? Because that's in a little bit of proof is in the pudding as to whether you see the espoused principles reflected in practice. So I think those are good things to focus on.
And outside of your own organization, do you see that other companies are reporting too much, reporting too little? Or is it a complete mix?
I'd say that the mix is quite large in terms of there's quite a lot of divergent practices, both within sectors, within geographies. Of course, you see some typical trends that the larger companies with more resources are more advanced on these topics than the smaller ones. I think you could also pick up on some trends that those companies that are most exposed to direct customer relationships, and therefore more exposed to reputational risks around poor performance on these topics, have had to focus on the topics perhaps a bit earlier than some of the companies that are more in a B2B space where that has been less important. But I think with the changes that are happening now in the EU, with the European Green Deal and the so-called EU taxonomy, which will present a much more stringent framework for separating the good performers from the mediocre performers, I think that we will see this take on a more professionalized and robust form across most large companies over time.
Yeah, no, very interesting. And in the last few years, and clearly you're a great example of this, we've seen the emergence of a number of new job titles, be that chief sustainability officers or global heads of ESG. And I think there's still a misunderstanding out there as to exactly what those roles will involve, but also what qualifies somebody to be appointed to them. And it strikes me just chatting to you that there's a huge range of skills that are required. What in your opinion are the most important ones?
Yes, I think, as you say, it would be difficult to find someone with in-depth knowledge in all of those different topics that I showed on the first slide. So I would perhaps focus on two key things. I think finding someone with a solid practical experience around what it takes to implement these standards in practice is very helpful. They will be better placed to spot the greenwashing attempts and to be able to penetrate some of that data and figure out what the real performance picture is like. And I think there'll often be better advisors also in terms of how to resolve difficulties and how to implement new approaches in the most cost-efficient way. So I think that practical experience is very important. But the second thing is, I think you'd want to try and find profiles that are able to approach this topic in a strategic way, that are not stuck just looking at the risks and the downsides, but that are able to connect this agenda to the future commercial objectives of the company. How can this benefit us? What are the positive crossovers? And that are able to do that for different parts of the operations in a strategic and creative way. I think that's the second thing I would emphasize.
Okay, no, thank you. And I'm going to ask you now to look into your crystal ball and give us your views on some of the things that you see happening in the future and how you see the function evolving. What are the pressures there will be, but also what other opportunities there will be moving forward?
Yes, I think the first thing to perhaps point out there is companies will be under greater scrutiny going forward than they have been. I touched upon that briefly with new regulations coming in that will request investors to be much more data-driven in their decisions around labeling of green versus not green activities, etc. And I think that will make it easier for different types of stakeholders to spot the difference between the robust players and those that are doing the minimum and trying to dress that up in some way. So to invest enough to be able to stand the test of that scrutiny over time, I think that's important. The second point perhaps is around imagining the future. This field moves very fast, and practices that were considered unproblematic a few years ago are suddenly thrown into question today, and standards that were sufficient today are unlikely to be sufficient in 2 to 3 years' time. And I think that's what makes this a little bit challenging, is that as you develop your approaches and as you take decisions on where to invest and how to develop, they need to stand that test of time. They need to be future-proofed in a way, and it is anybody's guess what that is going to look like 2 to 3 years down the road. But I think being able to navigate that possible opportunity space, and remembering that this is going to be this is going to be another important dimension of competitive play within sectors, and how are you well positioned, how do you ensure that you're well positioned in your sector to take on that competition in the years to come. I think that is the second thing to consider.
Thank you. Yeah, we're going to need to get you back, I think, in a few years' time, and check exactly where we are and get your prediction on the few years thereafter. Just a final question. I'm seeing a lot of parallels from a board composition perspective to that which I saw probably 10, 15 years ago when digitization really became another hot topic. And by that, I mean, we're seeing chairman creating an additional seat for a non-executive director, and maybe even an executive director to assume responsibility for the area of ESG. In some cases, we're seeing it being added to the responsibilities of the existing audit committee. And then we're also seeing a separate ESG committee being created, which then reports separately into the board. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you what you consider to be best practice, but I'm assuming that all of those are workable solutions as far as you're concerned.
Absolutely. I think it matters less exactly how you structure it. I think what's important is that it doesn't get buried too far down the list on the agenda of any committee or the overall board as such. I think we've seen some experiences where if you do that you risk then addressing only one little part of this wider picture. And I think what often gets missed out then is also that opportunity space, the upsides, the more creative, long-term strategic dimensions of it. So to make sure that you can create enough space and skills within the totality of the board follow-up of the company, I think that is the most essential part of it.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Maja, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat to you about ESG and some guidance from you in terms of how the board should engage with this very, very hot topic. Would love to chat to you again to see how things move forward. But until then, thanks again, and all the best.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.